Good morning, everyone. I am Jae-Young Lee, Health and Safety Consultant for Occupational Hygiene from Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, and I am one of the consultants in West Ontario region who provide air exposure assessments, which we will talk about later in the presentation. And I'm pleased to be your host this morning. Thank you for joining us for a session on MLITSD Occupational Hygiene Campaigns 2024 to 2025. Today's focus will be on the two campaigns currently underway, the exposure to chemical agents and WHMIS training. Inspections for both of these campaigns will start on July 2nd and run until March 31st, 2025. Before we get started, I'd like to take you through some webinar housekeeping. Your computer audio is best for this webinar. We recommend you mute other devices to avoid distractions. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. We will be gathering up questions and answering them at the end of the session. Following the webinar, we will also be sending you a list of helpful resources, including a question and answer document that summarizes the presentation content. Please note that your microphone will remain muted throughout the webinar, and you will not have the ability to turn your camera on. And finally, please note that today's session will be recorded and posted on our WSPS.ca website. If you need a refresher, you can come back to our site and rewatch. And a little bit more about the chat feature. The chat is public and viewable by all participants. And as mentioned, you may send your questions in the chat during the session. However, for ease of flow, questions will be answered at the end of the session. And to optimize your viewing experience, you do have the option to view the webinar in full screen mode. The full screen option can be accessed by selecting the ellipses or the three dots as indicated, and then choosing full screen from the menu. This session will include some interactive features. We've added some poll questions, which will appear on your screen and/or in the meeting chat. You just need to choose your answer and submit. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please send a message in the chat. And if you can't access the chat, then please respond to the meeting invite email you received from Safety Connections. And a quick final bit of business, please note that all images in this presentation are subject to copyright and should not be reproduced. Now that our housekeeping is done, it's time to meet our speakers. We're pleased to have Christina St. Pierre with us this morning. Christina is a provincial hygienist at the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. She leads a group of occupational hygienists within the ministry responsible for the enforcement of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations. She joined the ministry in 2013 as a hygiene consultant and became provincial hygienist in 2022. Prior to joining the ministry, Christina was an occupational hygienist with the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. She started her career in the nuclear industry and also has experience in private consulting and performing occupational hygiene surveys and laboratory analyses. Christina has a Master's of Engineering degree in occupational hygiene from the University of Toronto. She has been a certified industrial hygienist for over 20 years. Welcome, Christina. And from Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, Tony Volpato is joining us. Tony is a specialized consultant for occupational hygiene at WSPS. She joined WSPS over 20 years ago as a health and safety consultant. She delivers a variety of services, such as conducting hazard assessments and facilitating training on health and safety topics, such as certification training for joint health and safety committees, WHMIS, workplace inspections, and accident investigations. In 2019, Tony was very excited to earn the Certified Industrial Hygienist designation. She currently provides a variety of occupational hygiene services, such as noise and air assessments, respirator fit testing, and program development. Tony holds a master's degree in health science from the University of Toronto. Welcome, Tony. And now let's take a quick look at our agenda for today. Christina will begin by providing details of what is expected for this year's occupational hygiene campaigns. Then Tony will give us highlights of obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and relevant regulations. She'll also address what to expect during an inspection, share tips on how you can prepare for the campaigns, and review additional support and resources. As mentioned, I will be monitoring the chat, and questions posted there will be answered at the end of the session. We hope to have planned enough time for all the questions. However, if we do run out of time, we will follow up with you after the presentation to make sure your questions are answered. And also, please note that Christina will not answer any questions related to any ongoing investigations, specific orders that you may have received, or any ongoing ministry visit. So for specific questions, please connect with your inspector or call the ministry's Health and Safety Contact Center. So let's get started. First of all, we'd like to get to know you a little bit better. So please respond to our first poll. What industry do you work in? Do you work in agriculture, manufacturing, services, others? And if others, perhaps in the chat, you could share what industry that might be. And we have polls coming in. We have a lot of manufacturing that joined us. About 50% of our participants say are manufacturing. Quite a lot of others as well, 32%. Pharmaceutical, scrap metal recycling, oil and gas, education as well. Wow, lots of different industries joined us today. Excellent. Construction services. That's lots of variety. Excellent. All right. So thank you for all your inputs. And now I will hand it over to Christina to tell us about the campaigns.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm here to talk about the Ministry Occupational Hygiene campaigns for 2024-2025, which is our fiscal year that started on April 1st of this year. So just a bit of a disclaimer that this presentation has been prepared to assist workplace parties in understanding their obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations, but it does not constitute legal advice. So you are advised to contact your legal counsel or refer to the legislation if you need to determine your rights and responsibilities under the Act. Within the ministry, I work for the Fair, Safe, and Healthy Workplaces Division, where our vision is to make Ontario the most attractive place to work in the world because every employee is treated fairly and comes home safely. And we do this through our mission, where we set, communicate, and enforce legislation to help make Ontario workplaces fair, safe, and healthy. So as occupational hygienists, the primary objective of our profession is to prevent the occurrence of occupational illnesses, which may result from short-term or acute and chronic or long-term exposures to hazardous chemical agents in the workplace. And it is key to control these exposures to help lower the risk of workers developing an occupational illness. So every year the ministry sets campaigns and initiatives, and we differentiate between campaigns and initiatives by the duration of the event. Campaigns are year-long initiatives, while initiatives are shorter term that take place over a few months. And they involve focus inspections that look at specific hazards in workplaces. And as hygienists, we do our part in trying to lower the risk of developing occupational illness by setting our own campaigns. And they are listed here for 2024-25. So they are worker exposures to chemical agents in the workplace and WHMIS training based on the amended hazardous products regulations. occupational illnesses really do not get enough attention and focus, in my opinion. And there seems to be a lot of effort and attention placed on fatalities and critical injuries and other accidents that result from traumatic injuries. And occupational illnesses, fatalities from occupational illnesses actually account for 4 times more than fatalities from injuries. So we really need to focus our efforts into preventing these occupational illnesses. So for our first campaign, it is on worker exposures to chemical agents in the workplace. And this is essentially ensuring compliance with Regulation 833, which is our regulation to control of exposure to biological or chemical agents in all workplaces where this regulation applies. And more specifically, our hygienists will ensure that workers are not exposed to hazardous substances exceeding the occupational exposure limits. So Reg 833 has over 700 occupational exposure limits. Most of them are based on the ACGH TLVs, or the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists threshold limit values, but we do have our own Ontario limits as well that is listed in the Ontario table of the regulation. And so during this campaign, we will make sure that nobody's overexposed, and we will do that by assessing the exposures, by identifying the hazards, observing the work practices in the work process, and evaluating the effectiveness of controls like ventilation, personal protective equipment, and things like that. During the inspections, we will also look to see if the workplace had done their own exposure monitoring, in which case we will review that data. And in some cases where it has not been done, we may also issue a requirement for the employer to do air sampling at their own expense. We also do have a limited budget within the ministry to do air sampling for some workplaces. And we typically do this for smaller workplaces just to kind of help them out when they don't have the resources. And you may have heard also that there was an announcement that was made a few months ago regarding an exposure surveillance system. So part of this campaign is to contribute to the development of that exposure surveillance system, which will be a compilation of all worker exposures to different substances in different industries. And the intent is to identify where the hazards are, where the high-risk areas are, and focus our efforts on preventing those exposures. In terms of timing, this will take place. There are 2 phases to our campaigns. There's one on education, and the first phase is on education and outreach, which will take place throughout the entire fiscal year. And it's essentially what we're doing today, kind of promoting and letting you know what these campaigns are all about. And then there's the second phase is the actual enforcement, which, as Jay Young mentioned earlier, will start on July 2nd and will continue through to the end of March of 2025. And that is when our inspectors or hygienists will proactively visit workplaces in any sector where workers may be exposed to chemical agents. I should qualify that by saying that any workplace where Reg 833 applies. So I know from the poll earlier, there were some in the audience from the agriculture industry. And so for farming, Reg 833 actually doesn't apply. However, there may be parts of the agriculture operation that may fall under the industrial establishment, in which case Reg 833 will apply, and we will be conducting this campaign in those workplaces. Also note that just because the campaign doesn't apply, if we are in your workplace, we are going to go through our normal enforcement activities. So we would look at chemical exposures in general and enforce them as well, not through Reg 833, but through the Act to make sure that the employer is taking reasonable precautions to protect the health and safety of the worker. I also noticed earlier that there are some in the audience also from the construction industry. So there is a sub-focus in this campaign on silica in construction for the purpose of promoting the silica control tool. You may not have heard of this tool, but it's a tool that was developed in BC. And what it does is it estimates worker exposures to silica in construction workplaces based on what tools they're using, what materials they are working with, and what controls they have in place. And instead of air sampling, it doesn't completely replace air sampling, but it does give you an idea of what the worker exposures could be in the absence of air sampling. So that is something that could be useful for workplaces in construction. Right now, it's only in construction, but that is also something that we will be promoting through this campaign. The other campaign, which I will spend a little bit more time on, is on WHMIS training based on the amended hazardous products regulations. So this is essentially enforcement of Reg 860, which is a WHMIS regulation in all workplaces where this regulation applies. So again, for agriculture, or sorry, for farming, may not apply. They will not apply for the farming part of your operation, but for the industrial part of your operation, if you have any, this campaign will apply as well. And more specifically, our hygienists will determine if retraining on WHMIS will be required, depending on whether the hazardous products in the workplace have labels and safety data sheets that are compliant with the amended hazardous products regulations. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but I will break that down in the next few slides. So again, as far as timing goes, it's the same as the other campaign. There are 2 phases to the campaign. The first part is education and outreach, which we will do throughout the entire fiscal year. And then the enforcement part, which will start on July 2nd of 2024 and will continue through to the end of the fiscal year. And this is when our hygienists and inspectors will conduct proactive inspections in any workplace where their workers work with or may be exposed to hazardous products, and where Reg 860 applies. So we're not focusing, just like the other campaign, we're not focusing on any specific chemical exposure or chemical product, nor any specific industry. These 2 campaigns will apply anywhere where Reg 833 and 860 apply. Okay, here's a question for you. Who do you think is responsible for enforcing WHMIS legislation in Ontario? Is it Health Canada, Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development, Transport Canada, or Ministry of Government and Consumer Services? So select whichever one you think applies, and there could be one. Sorry, there could be more than one. Okay, so looks like a lot of you had chosen the Ministry of Labor. Second most popular choice is Health Canada. And then the other selections are kind of equally divided. Okay. The answer is actually Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, Skills Development, and Health Canada. So this is how WHMIS is enforced in the province. And the one that you might be more familiar with is provincial enforcement, which is the enforcement of Reg 860. And this applies where hazardous products are used, stored, and handled. And in this regulation, it requires the employer to make sure that information is communicated to workers through safety data sheets, labels on the containers of hazardous products, and worker education or WHMIS training. So that's the WHMIS enforcement that you're probably most familiar with. But there's actually a second part to WHMIS enforcement, and that is at the federal level. So at the federal level, there is the Hazardous Products Act, which requires suppliers to provide safety data sheets and label the containers of hazardous products when they are selling hazardous products to their customers. And by suppliers here, we mean manufacturers, importers, and distributors. Under that act is the Hazardous Products Regulations, and it's really only one regulation. Not sure why they call it regulations, but the HPR outlines the criteria for classifying hazardous products and the required information elements in the SDS and labels. So essentially, it's telling the suppliers how to classify their products, and it's also telling the suppliers what information needs to be in the SDS and labels. And it is the HPR that changed back in December 15th of 2022, which kind of influenced our provincial WHMIS campaign, which I will tie back into this at the end of this presentation. But the way Health Canada enforces the HPA and the HPR, they've actually delegated this authority to inspectors in the provinces and the territories. So for Ontario, it's that authorization fell on our ministry hygienists. So our hygienists are actually also designated as HPA inspectors with the authority to enforce the Hazardous Products Act and regulations. So you can look at it as kind of we go the extra step by not just making sure that there are SDS and labels and training, but we're also making sure that the information in the SDS and labels are complete and accurate. So I'm now going to go through the changes in the amended HPR. But just before I do that, I just want to kind of do a brief review of safety data sheets. So you may recall that back in 2015, WHMIS had changed. By the way, it's not called WHMIS 2015 anymore. It's just called WHMIS because maybe WHMIS 2015 sounds really old and really now it's just WHMIS. So that's just what we're calling it. But back in 2015, the format for the SDSs had been standardized. So all SDSs should have the same 16 sections, which will include hazards identification, composition information on ingredients, physical and chemical properties, and toxicological information. And to classify the products, you can first classify it either under a physical hazard class and or a health hazard class. In most cases, they actually fall under both. So examples of physical hazard classes include flammable liquids or chemicals under pressure, and examples of a health hazard class would be carcinogenicity and serious eye damage, eye irritation. And then you can further categorize it into 1, 2, 3, or 4, with 1 being the most severe. And the HPR outlines the criteria on how to categorize a product under these different categories. So it'll be based on the product's chemical and physical properties and toxicological properties. And then in some cases, they could still be further subcategorized to A, B, or C. And again, A is the most severe, C being the least severe. And again, the HPR will tell you what the criteria are to subcategorize the product. So an example would be something like, say, sulfuric acid, which we know is highly corrosive. So it may have hazard classification of skin corrosion, category 1A. So it's 1, meaning it's really bad, and A also means that it's really bad. So just to test your knowledge, and please don't cheat and pull out a safety data sheet, what section of the safety data sheet do you think indicates the hazard classification of the product? Okay, that's encouraging, and I'm glad to see that most of you got the correct answer, and it is section 2. And the reason I asked that is because a lot of the changes in the HPR actually apply to this section of the SDS. So this is where the hazard classifications are indicated. And personally, I actually think this is one of the most important parts of the SDS because it tells you exactly what the hazard of the product is. But under this section in the amended HPR, there's a new physical hazard class that's been introduced, and it's called chemicals under pressure. And then the flammable aerosols hazard class name has been changed to aerosols, so it's only called aerosols now. And there's also a new category, category 3 for non-flammable aerosol products that has been adopted under this hazard class. There are also new subcategories of flammable gases for category 1. And the pyrophoric gases hazard class has been repealed, so it's no more, and it's been replaced, or at least the products that used to be classified under that hazard class are now under the subcategory of flammable gases category 1A. So it seems like a lot, but a lot of this really applied to suppliers when they're classifying their products. But for the end user, what you may see is some of these hazard classifications, if they apply to a product, might look different in the amended HPR SDSs. And then there's also for products classified under combustible dust, there is a second option for the hazard statement that is introduced, and it is may form explosible dust air mixture. So for each hazard classification, there is an associated hazard statement that needs to be put into this section. And the wording for the hazard statement has to be exactly as it's indicated in the HBR. And there usually only is one option for each hazard hazard category. But for combustible gas, they've now given the suppliers an option for that statement, and they can use either one depending on which one is more applicable to their product. So again, if you're getting updated SDSs, you may look in the section and see that some of the wording had been changed depending on if the product applies, sorry, if these changes apply to your product, and if the supplier had decided to use different wording for their hazard statements. For section 3, this is where the ingredients are listed. There's now an allowance for the use of narrower concentration ranges that fall within one of the prescribed concentration ranges. So that sounds maybe a little bit confusing, but all that means is if the supplier does not want to disclose the exact concentration or concentration range of an ingredient, they are allowed to use one of the prescribed concentration ranges in the HBR. So there's a list of them. They could be 5 to 10%, 10 to 15%, 15 or 30%, and so on. But if they actually want to be a little bit more accurate, still without disclosing the actual concentration, they can use a narrow concentration range as long as it falls under one of the prescribed concentration ranges. So for example, if the prescribed concentration range is 30 to 50%, they can also report 35 to 40% if they want to be a little bit more accurate. So that's allowable under the amended HBR now. And then as far as reporting the ingredients, there is a cutoff concentration where the suppliers are required to report an ingredient under this section. But under the amended HBR, regardless of whether that ingredient contributes to the hazardous classification of the product, they now need to disclose all the ingredients that meet that cutoff level. So what this means for you as the end user is that when you get the updated SDS and you're looking at this section, you might think your product composition had changed because there might be some additional ingredients listed or some of the concentrations might have changed, but that's not necessarily the case. It might just mean that your supplier under the amended HBR have now changed the way they're reporting the ingredients list. So double check with your supplier just to make sure the composition is not changed. Okay, and now for section 9 of the SDS, this is where the chemical and physical properties are listed. Under this section, there's a whole list of chemical physical property headings that need to be reported in this section. So regardless of whether the heading applies to the product or not, the heading still needs to be in this SDS. For example, something like pH will not apply to a solid product, but they still need to put pH under this section and just put not applicable because it doesn't apply for that product. Or if the information is not available, they can indicate not available, but they still need to put the heading in this section. A change in the HBR is that for some of the properties that are listed here, there's some that had been changed a little bit, and there's also one that's been added called particle characteristics. And this is actually an easy way for you to determine if your SDS has changed or not. Just look at this section, see if you see the heading particle characteristics, and if it's there, then most likely your SDS has already been updated to the amended HBR. So it's kind of a quick trick to try and figure out if your SDS has been updated. And when SDSs are updated, the supplier has a responsibility to communicate that to their customers. And under the amended HBR, normally they would just back up a bit. Normally they would just send you the updated SDS. But under the amended HBR, they now have to add another document to that communication to let the customer know what the changes are and when they came into effect. So that's essentially the second paragraph of this slide. So it's just enhancing communication of the changes. So to tie this all back to our campaign, suppliers have been given a 3-year transition period. So you may recall that the changes in the HPR came into effect December 15th of 2022, and the suppliers have until December 14th, 2025 to revise their SDS and labels to comply with the amended HPR. So what this means for you as a user is that during that 3-year transition period, you may start receiving SDSs that are updated to amended HPR. And when you do, that would trigger retraining on WHMIS to make sure that your workers are aware of the changes and that they understand the different information label elements in the SDS. And that's what our campaign is all about. Our hygienists will be looking to review the SDSs as they normally would, and where they find that the SDSs had already been updated, they would then make sure that the workers have been updated on their WHMIS training, and that could be an order in some situations. In our regulations, there is no prescribed frequency of WHMIS retraining. It really is determining the knowledge transfer, making sure that the knowledge is still there, and where it's not there anymore or it's a little bit deficient, then that would trigger possibly an order for retraining on WHMIS. And also things like this, where there are significant changes in the SDS and labels and hazard communication, that would also trigger WHMIS training. So that's what our WHMIS campaign is all about. If you want more information on the changes in the HPR, I've only touched upon a few, but those are the ones that are most visible and will most likely be the ones that you will encounter. But I did include a link here for you to find out more about the changes in the HPR if you are interested. And that concludes my presentation, and I am going to pass it on to Tony. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Christina, for all the details you have provided regarding these campaigns. We really appreciate your expertise on these topics. And now I will continue with highlighting the relevant legislation obligations for these two campaigns. Specifically touching on the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Regulation 833, Control of Exposure to Biological Chemicals, and Regulation 860, we all know as WHMIS. So are you complying with the general duties outlined in the Occupational Health and Safety Act? The employers have several duties outlined in sections 25 and 26. And just briefly, as a reminder, employers must take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance for the protection of the worker. And this really is an all-encompassing duty, which includes protection from hazardous chemicals. Employers need to ensure that proper equipment is provided and maintained in good condition, such as local exhaust ventilation, if needed to minimize chemical exposure. Employers also need to provide information and instruction to a worker regarding any hazard in the workplace, including the handling, storage, use, disposal, and transport of hazardous chemicals. And in addition, if an employer is advised by a worker or on behalf of a worker that they have an occupational illness, or if a WSIB claim has been filed, the employer needs to report this to the MLITSD within 4 days of becoming aware of it. And this can be done directly online. The employer also needs to report it to the committee, health and safety representative, and the union if applicable. Supervisors' duties are all found in section 27, and they also, like the employer, need to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance for the protection of a worker. They must advise workers of the hazards on the job and train them how to work safely. And a very important part of a supervisor is to enforce company rules and to ensure workers are actually working safely and using their proper PPE when necessary, such as protective gloves or respirators if those are required. And of course, workers have duties too. Workers need to actually follow the safe rules and work safely as they've been trained from their employer and supervisor. And of course, report any health and safety concerns to their supervisor if they have any concerns or if they've suffered an illness or an injury at work. The powers and duties of the health and safety representative can be found in Section 8, and Section 9 is where you will find most of the information regarding the Joint Health and Safety Committee responsibilities and powers. Of particular interest for these campaigns, a worker representative from the Joint Health and Safety Committee, or a worker rep, is always welcome to be present at the beginning of any testing, such as the air exposure assessment that could be done by a hygienist, that this would be done to determine potential levels of these hazardous chemicals. They also can obtain information from the employer respecting identification of any hazardous materials. In addition, in the Act, an important part, Section 42, talks about instruction and training. So the employer shall ensure, so that really it means must, ensure that a worker exposed or likely to be exposed to a hazardous material receives instruction and training. And that instruction and training must be developed and implemented by the employer in consultation with the committee or your health and safety representative. So I'm not sure if a lot of people realize this part is in the Act. So really we're talking about your WHMIS program. In the program. The review, there's also a section about a review. The employer shall review in consultation with the committee or rep the training and instruction provided to the worker at least annually. And that review shall be held more frequently than annually if the employer, on the advice of the committee or rep, determines it's necessary, or if there's a change in circumstance that may affect the health and safety of a worker. Employers' duties also in Section 3 are clear and say that employers must take all measures reasonably necessary in the circumstance to protect workers from exposure to a hazardous biological or chemical agent because of the storage, handling, process, or use of such agent in the workplace. And the measures to be taken shall include, and these may look very similar to your hierarchy of controls. So starting off with substitution of the hazardous biological or chemical agent, engineering controls, administrative controls, including safe work practices, and hygiene facilities and practices. So even having water and soap available for people to wash up. And if Section 7.2 applies, personal protective equipment. So what does 7.2 say? An employer shall protect workers from exposure to a hazardous biological or chemical agent without requiring them to wear a respirator, unless subsection 2 applies, or the employer complies with an applicable code of practice. So what does subsection 2 say? The employer shall provide the work, and the workers shall wear and use a respirator appropriate in the circumstance to protect workers from exposure to the agent. And the respirator needs to be appropriate because not every respirator is the same and will protect the people from the same agent. But respirators are like a last resort. So that it is okay only if a substitution of the agent is not reasonable or not practical. If engineering controls required by the regulation are not in existence or are not obtainable, are not reasonable or not practical to adopt, install, or provide because of the duration or frequency of the exposure, or because of the nature of the process, operation, or work, or are rendered ineffective because of a temporary breakdown of the controls, or ineffective to prevent control or limit exposure because of an emergency. So those are the instances when respirators are okay to use. Now, if an employer who provides a worker with a respirator, they must comply with sections 9 through 13 of the Regulation 833. And those are all the details that are laid out in terms of what you would need for a respirator protection program. Now, we don't have time today to go into all of those details, but we do definitely, we've already have a pre-recorded safety connection on this topic. So you are welcome to view that. It's on our website for you. I'd like to just start off with a definition of Regulation 833 in terms of our exposure limits. So Christina was mentioning earlier, this is a big part of their campaign, is wanting to make sure people are not being overexposed to the chemicals. So in our regulation, we have these three main terms. The TWA is the time-weighted average, airborne concentration of a biological or chemical agent to which a worker may be exposed in a work day or a work week. So it's the full shift. There's also a short-term exposure limit. This is a much shorter period of time. So it's only 15 minutes, and it's often a higher exposure limit, but no more than 4 times during an 8-hour shift, and with at least 1 hour between exposures. And the third is called a ceiling limit. And I think this is a good name because you can picture a ceiling. This is what the concentration that the chemical agent, it should never be exposed to at any time. So you would never want to go over that concentration. So in Regulation 833, Section 4 talks about that the employer needs to limit the exposure of workers to hazardous biological or chemical agents in accordance with the following rules. If the agent is listed in the Ontario table of the regulation, the exposure shall not exceed the TWA, STEL, or ceiling set out in that table. If the agent is not listed in the Ontario table, but is listed in the ACGIH table, as Christina mentioned, exposure shall not exceed those exposure limits set out in that table. So if the table that applies under paragraph 1 or 2 of a TDA for an agent, but sets out neither a STEL nor a C, so they have a TWA, but they don't have a STEL or a C, exposure shall not exceed the following excursion limits, we call them. 3 times that of the TWA for a period of 30 minutes, for any period of 30 minutes, or 5 times the TWA at any time. So that's like a ceiling limit. So how are you going to know what the exposure limits are? The best place to go is online. The ministry has this website, and I took a snip of it. This is what it looks like. So you can search it up, and it's called the Current Occupational Exposure Limits for Ontario Workplaces under Regulation 833. And I took a snip here too of this first part of the table. And here is where you will find your chemicals of interest. So again, you've got to gather your safety data sheets, and the actual name of the hazardous product will be in section 3 and 8. So there you need to be looking in those sections to actually find out the proper name or the CAS number. So you can see along the top, the columns or the Ontario table listing. It'll tell you if it's in the Ontario table or not. Then it mentions the agent name or the CAS number. I think the easiest thing to do is you just click Control F and search by that CAS number so you find the exact proper chemical that you're interested in, because sometimes chemicals have different names. So I always go by the CAS number. And then you can see the time-weighted average, the STEL, and the ceiling limits across as you go, and a notation if it applies. So for example, if we were curious about and wanted to know about acetone, it's second from the bottom. You can see it has a TWA of 255 parts per million and a STEL of 500 parts per million. And there's no notations for acetone. Whereas if it has a C, you can see the one below, C is for ceiling limit. And I will talk about this skin notation in a moment. So in section 6, the employer needs to ensure that procedures for monitoring, sampling, and determining airborne concentrations comply with a standard method for workplace air sampling and analysis, or another method recognized in industrial hygiene practices, and are performed by or under the direction of a person who is qualified because of their knowledge, training, and experience in industrial hygiene. So if you need to have this done, you definitely will search out someone with this expertise. So someone with the CIH, Certified Industrial Hygienist qualifications, or ROH, Registered Occupational Hygienist, though that is like the Canadian version. Those people with those designations have studied and know all about the proper sampling and connecting with the proper laboratories on how to sample these certain chemicals and how to do that properly. Section 7 here, it says, if an agent at work listed in Ontario table or the ACGH table includes the notation skin, protect workers from skin absorption. So this is really just highlighting if it has been noted in the notations that skin here, you really need to pay particular attention because health effects could happen through exposure through the skin. So really checking out your safety data sheet and understanding, do I have the proper gloves or protective clothing so I don't get any absorption through the skin? Because again, all gloves are not made the same. So you want to make sure you're getting the proper glove and they fit properly, and people have some training on the importance of that. And if you have questions, you can also connect with your supplier on proper glove selection. It also says if an agent in the ACGIH table includes the reference for a simple asphyxiant or CF Appendix F, minimal oxygen content, protect workers from exposure to an atmospheric oxygen level of less than 19.5% by volume, and related hazards such as fire and explosion. So again, this makes complete sense. We need to make sure people have enough oxygen when they're working because some chemicals may actually displace oxygen and could be a fire or explosion hazard. So really important to understand that and reading those details, both in the safety data sheet and the exposure limit tables. In Section 8, it says, if a worker has been exposed to a hazardous biological or chemical agent, and the worker or the worker's physician has reason to believe that the worker's health has been affected by exposure to the agent, and the worker or the worker's physician has notified the employer in writing, or the employer has reason to believe that the worker's health is likely to be affected by the exposure, and the employer has notified the worker in writing, the worker, if he or she agrees, shall undergo medical examination and clinical tests at the employer's expense to determine whether the worker has an occupational illness because of exposure to the agent, and whether the worker is fit with limitations, or unfit to continue working in the exposure to the agent. So those are really one of three conclusions that the physician will come up with. And depending on those results, if everything is okay, the worker can go back to work, or if they are suffering some type of illness, there may be limitations on what their exposure could be. Also, the employer shall provide the physician who examines the worker with a copy of the records, if any, of the exposure of the worker to the hazardous biological or chemical agent. So the idea is if you've had a hygienist come in and do an exposure assessment, you definitely want to keep those reports, and those would be made available to the physician as well. So switching to Regulation 860, WHMIS, I know we all know that everyone has the right to know about the workplace hazards that they're working in, including hazardous materials and how to protect themselves. But of course, with our rights, we all have responsibilities, which I will review briefly here. So the employer under WHMIS must develop a safety data sheet for any hazardous product produced internally. They have to ensure all containers entering the workplace are labeled with the supplier label. Ensure workplace labels are applied when necessary. Update the labels and safety data sheets when significant new data becomes available, and ensure safety data sheets are available and accessible to all workers. So this could be, a binder, which I've seen so many times, a hard copy or electronic, but the key thing is that it always needs to be accessible to workers, and workers know how to obtain the information. Now, Section 6 and 7 of WHMIS is very important. This is where they talk about worker education. An employer shall ensure that every worker who works with or who may be exposed in the course of his or her work to a hazardous product is instructed in the contents required on labels and the purpose and significance of the information on those labels, and the contents required on a safety data sheet and the purpose and significance of the information there. And C is very important. Procedures for the safe use, storage, handling, and disposal of hazardous products. So this really, I think, speaks highly, focusing in on your WHMIS specific training, right? So generic training, you're learning about the symbols, the labels, safety data sheets. That often is done very well with generic training, a 1-hour e-course. But don't forget about the workplace specific part of your WHMIS training, where you're taking the time to really understand and educate the workers. Here's the chemicals you're handling, and here's how we need you to work safely so you are not overexposed. Okay, and then the last one there mentions procedures for the safe use, storage, handling, and disposal of hazardous product when it is contained or transferred. Now, Christina was telling me a WHMIS training order may be issued under 6 or 7 of the WHMIS regulation. So again, these sections are of particular interest. And she definitely reinforces with me as well. WHMIS training must always be site-specific to ensure that workers are knowledgeable about the hazards of the product they work with. And that makes complete sense, I think. And a reminder, make sure you are reviewing your WHMIS program on an annual basis with the committee and health and safety rep and document it in your minutes. So the idea here is annually reviewing the program. So things are like, do we have a current inventory of all the chemicals? Do we have a safety data sheet for all the chemicals that we have? Are our people educated on all of those things, or do we need to do retraining? So those are things to consider and document that you've done that review. And to support Christina as well, employers that receive hazardous products with labels and safety data sheets that are compliant with the amended Hazardous Products Regulation are responsible to ensure their workers receive chemical-specific WHMIS training, regardless of the chemical being new or not to the workplace. And you want to document that. So documentation is always good. The date, who attended, what the training material was, and the participants, of course. Supervisors' duties for WHMIS, they most likely, a lot of them are providing this training and education on how to handle the chemicals safely, and they enforce those safe work procedures and ensuring people are actually working safely and using the proper PPE. And they, of course, have to take every precaution reasonable for the protection of the workers. And workers, they, of course, have to attend the training and pay attention, right? Follow the generic training, pay attention to the chemical safe procedures that they're being taught, and then actually use that learning back out in the workplace. Wear and care for the required PPE properly. So definitely, I've seen a few times, the respirator just thrown on the dirty workbench. So, just wanting to make sure people understand the importance of how to care for their PPE, store it properly, keeping it clean, when to get new PPE. And of course, report any concerns to their supervisor they have for anything for health and safety, really. And suppliers, they have to ensure their supplier label is attached, make sure the SDS contains up-to-date information, is available in both English and French, and provide a copy to the purchaser. So what to expect during an inspection? During an inspection, inspectors will enforce the Act and its regulations based on the facts at the time of the inspection. An inspector has the right to enter and be granted access to all areas of your workplace. When an inspector arrives at your workplace, they will introduce themselves, explain the reason for their visit, and ask to have a worker and management representative accompany them during the inspection. The inspector may conduct an administrative review and a physical inspection of the workplace. So they might be looking at both your training records, your safe procedures that you've developed, and also looking around, looking at your physical workplace, looking for potential contraventions or hazards to the worker. If an inspector finds a contravention, an order may be issued. The inspector will explain the contravention and may refer the workplace to a health and safety association like WSPS for compliance assistance. And that's something we do very often to help our employers understand what's required of them and help them become compliant. Inspectors can also issue stop work orders where they see an immediate threat to a worker's health and safety. Right, so that can happen as well, and you have to stop the work until they say it's okay to start again and things are safe. A field visit report outlining all the details of the visit, including any orders issued, will be provided to the employer. So tips to prepare. Prevention is key. What can you do? So I think we all agree, nobody wants anyone to develop an illness at work. So as employers, we can follow this RACE model, which I think is very logical. Starting out with recognize. You can't fix something if you don't know you have it. So recognizing any hazardous products you've got in your workplace is the starting point. Then you assess them. How hazardous are they? Who's potentially being exposed? And then putting your controls in place to ensure people are not being overexposed. And then lastly, don't forget to evaluate, because you want to check in. Did your controls actually work? Or did you potentially cause a hazard that you hadn't thought of when you made those changes? So just quickly, in terms of recognizing, what chemicals are in the workplace? Do you, again, have your current inventory and a safety data sheet for all of your chemicals? Have they been updated to the new requirements yet? So definitely, you don't have to do this alone. Get everyone involved in your workplace to help you gather all this information. And then you are assessing. So you're thinking about where are the chemicals being stored, handled, disposed of, and who potentially could be exposed. So I like to kind of think of it as, you know, the chemicals are coming into the workplace, being handled, and then disposed of potentially. So who along that train could be exposed? So any materials handlers, who's involved when it comes into the workplace, any production workers as they're being handled, maintenance people, housekeeping people, anybody handling the disposal part of it. So really thinking about all of those people. And how hazardous are the chemicals? So again, you don't know that until you check the safety data sheets. So you're looking at those specifically. And the occupational hygienist would definitely require those if they're going to be doing air sampling for you. And so you can go through those together. And is there an occupational exposure limit? So that, again, like I mentioned earlier, you're looking specifically for those chemicals and looking up the exposure limit. Okay. Has exposure monitoring been completed in the past? This may have been done and you didn't know about it, so you want to go doing some digging. And if you find them, and it may have been a few years, you want to just be asking yourselves, has anything changed since it's been done? Are there any different processes, maybe even different chemicals, different controls in place that could affect the exposure level? And then determining, do we need to do further air exposure monitoring now to see where we're at? And of course, are those results below occupational exposure limits? Right. So as a hygienist, we would come in, and if you haven't seen this done before, basically we get a good strategy together, and we would be coming in and having the workers who we want to assess their exposure wear sampling equipment. And the easiest ones are nice. They're just like a little badge, and they're placed close to your breathing zone. And the idea is that the worker will just, do their regular job, and hopefully that won't bother them much, but it will be capturing the what a worker would be breathing in that day. Depending again on the chemical will depend how we have to sample. So some are a cassette, and it actually requires a pump to draw the air through, and it gets the samples get collected on a cassette, and they get sent to the laboratory, and the laboratory will give us the results and give us a number, a concentration, and we compare that to the exposure level. So our last poll of our session, please join in and answer our question. Has your organization conducted an occupational hygiene air exposure assessment for certain chemicals in your workplace? Yes, no, or not sure? So thank you. I see the results are coming in. Wow, this is great. At least half of you have already done this. So that's excellent to see. And some are not sure, and some you haven't. So that's very encouraging to see. Almost 60% now have already done this. So thank you very much for participating. That's very interesting. Okay. So just a few words on monitoring strategy. So when you connect with your hygienist who's going to do the work, these are some questions that you're going to be thinking about and talking about to determine a good strategy. So of course, what and how are you sampling for? So looking at your safety data sheets, what chemicals are of most interest. They will know how to sample for it. And they really need your help, though, to understand who are we sampling, right? How is it working in your workplace? So where and when to sample, how long to sample, how many samples, how many people. We want to make sure we're getting the right people involved. And a question always we ask is, was the sampling done on a heavy or a light day? Because we want to capture that in the report too, because the idea is when we come, you want to be doing a typical day. Hopefully, we don't want to come and you're not even using the chemical that day for some reason, the equipment's down or something. So you definitely have that discussion with your hygienist. But we want to get a true sample of what somebody would be exposed to throughout a workday. So in terms of controls, just briefly, you probably have all seen this hierarchy of control before, but it's a great visual in terms of, if you come have results that you are overexposed, you need to implement further controls. This is a great diagram that you can always pull out and help you brainstorm what are potential solutions. So starting at the top, elimination is always the best. If you can get rid of it and you don't need it, you don't need to worry about it, that would be wonderful. That's not always possible, but so you may need to look at substitution. Is there a chemical that's just as good but less hazardous? Could we use that? Engineer controls, so things like general ventilation, but also local exhaust is fantastic for this airborne type of concerns, because if you can get air to be drawn away from the engineering controls so it doesn't even enter the worker's breathing zone, that's beautiful. I think awareness and administrative controls are likely always a great idea in terms of developing safe work procedures. Maybe signage needs to be put up, working in different areas, but really having good safe procedures written, people getting their training done. Other administrative controls could be job rotation, so people just are not around that chemical all day. And then lastly is personal protective equipment. So unfortunately, a lot of people I may have come across over the many years now is that they have a problem and they just initially think of, put on personal protective equipment. But really, this is the last resort, and sometimes it is necessary for sure, but you don't want to just rely on PPE. So thinking about all those other controls, which are much more effective, because when people have to wear PPE, well, you have to rely on them to actually wear it. A lot of people don't like it. If it's, if they don't have it fitting right or working right, it's just, it's great to avoid and not need it in the first place to get our exposure levels nice and low. And then lastly, evaluate. So you put all your controls in place, have your controls improve the exposure level, right? And thinking about when should I do remonitoring? Because if the levels were high, you're doing a lot of different things to make things better, and you would want to check in at a right amount of time to make sure that your controls were effective. And of course, ask those questions. Have I created a new hazard? Are the supervisors and workers content with the changes? Getting their feedback and consulting with the committee and health and safety rep is always so important to get workers' feedback so you can continue to make changes that workers are protected and they are happy to come to work as well. So some tips to prepare for WHMIS in particular, the WHMIS campaign. So review your safety data sheets and your inventory. Ensure you have an up-to-date inventory with safety data sheets for everything that's in your workplace for your hazardous materials. Have those safety data sheets been updated? And if so, you need to conduct your WHMIS training, both the generic and the workplace specific as we discussed. And don't forget to document your training and review your WHMIS program on an annual basis with your committee or your health and safety representative. In terms of the chemical exposure campaign, similarly, reviewing your safety data sheets, they're so important. And here you're going to be specifically checking out section 3 and 8, where you'll find out those details about the ingredients and figuring out which occupational exposure limits are applicable. You can gather previous exposure monitoring reports if you have them, and you're considering again, when was it completed? Is it still relevant? Have things changed at all? And just determining if you need to remonitor or not. You may not. If you are up on this and you've actually, done this very recently, then you're good to go and you're ready if an inspector comes in. And definitely, if you have plans to do some air exposure assessments, discuss that monitoring strategy with, of course, a qualified occupational hygienist or industrial hygienist and your committee, right? Getting your committee involved and strategizing to make sure you're really assessing the right people and getting a really good sampling of potential exposures. And then, of course, review the results and implement controls as necessary. So hopefully your controls are in place, everything is good. But if you do find that exposure levels are high, you definitely need to put in controls in place. So connecting with your committee, they can help also think of solutions as well as there will be solutions suggested from our reports anyway for ideas for controls. So some of our resources that we have to assist you, specifically for WHMIS as well. Well, actually, the first bullet here talks about our FAQ document. The three of us together put this document. We tried to brainstorm all the potential questions that may come up. So that's, I think, a pretty good document. We'll be sending everybody, and it will be posted to our website as well. We also at WSPS have services that can help you develop, I guess, your WHMIS or chemical program development. We've listed there, as well as a variety of WHMIS training options, both generic, and we can help you with customizing workplace specific training too, if you need support there. In terms of the chemical exposure campaign, how can we help? Well, we have occupational hygienists across Ontario that do the air assessment exposure monitoring. We also help if you have designated substances. We provide training as well on potential if you need assistance with your control program, respirator fit testing, and as I mentioned, we do have some safety connections already pre-recorded that may be of interest for you. specifically respirator protection program and designated substance assessments. And if you like, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's on our website there. You can sign up as well. We are offering additional safety connections September and January. It will be a bit more detailed in terms of how to prepare for these. So we're offering those as well if you would like to attend. So you can look for that as well. The resources from the MLITSD, we've listed here the various regulations and that link to the exposure limits where you'd want to search for the OELs. OCOW and CCOHS always have a lot of great information, so don't forget to check them out as well for support. And here's our references for developing the program today. So questions, and now I will hand it back over to Jay Young for questions.
Thank you, Tony, for the excellent presentation and information. So the first question we have is about agriculture and Regulation 833. How do we know if Regulation 833 applies to us if we are in agriculture?
So Reg 833 does not apply to farming operations. And there is a definition of farming operations somewhere on our website. It says farming operations can be described as primarily the production, cultivation, growing, and harvesting of agricultural commodities and any practices performed as an integral part of a farming operation. So if you fall under that definition, the only regulations that apply to farming are notification of fatalities, critical injuries, occupational illnesses, the basic awareness training regulation, noise, we did manage to get that into farming, and then the naloxone kits regulation, which is relatively new. Other than that, all the other regulations do not apply to farming. Having said that, if there is a part of your operation that falls under the industrial regulation, then Reg 833 will apply to that. So an example would be something like a cannabis grow-up operation where you've got the farming part of it where you're growing the plants, and then you've got the extraction part where you're, sorry, I don't know cannabis well, I'm not a personal user, but where you're extracting the oils and all the good stuff. There are a lot of hazards associated with that, and that would fall under an established industrial establishment, and Reg 833 will apply to that. So it could be that not all your entire operation be classified as farming, but if it is, then Reg 833 doesn't apply.
Excellent, thank you for that. And next, earlier in the presentation, it was mentioned about WHMIS 2015 and that now it's called WHMIS, but I see in the chat that some have mentioned that they are aware of WHMIS 2022 and WHMIS 2024. So could you perhaps maybe clarify on that?
Yeah, that's news to me. So if you know something I don't, please let me know. It's not like an iPhone where we would issue a different version every year. As far as I know, it's only WHMIS 2015, which has now been renamed as just WHMIS. So prior to that, we did kind of make a distinction between the new and old WHMIS. It was WHMIS 1988, and then WHMIS 2015 was a new version. But as far as I know, it's just called WHMIS. So again, if you know something different, please let me know.
Thank you. And to clarify, annual WHMIS training is not necessarily required. A review of the WHMIS program, including training, needs to be done annually, is the question.
Correct. So there is a section in the Occupational Health and Safety Act that requires the employer to review their health and safety programs annually. So one of those health and safety programs could be your WHMIS program. But as far as, so you're just reviewing the program, it's not necessarily a requirement to retrain everybody on WHMIS annually. Having said that, if there are significant changes like the amended HPR in the SDS information or in the products that you're using or how you're handling the chemicals and all that kind of stuff, then you will need to do retraining to cover those changes. And the frequency of that will be up to you. Ultimately, when we do our inspections, we would talk to workers and make sure that they understand the hazards of the chemicals that they're using. And if we see that there's a gap in their knowledge, then it might be a trigger for the employer to redo WHMIS training at that point. Best practice is annually, but it's really up to you. That's not prescribed in the regulation.
Thank you. And next question is noise assessment included? And I'm understanding this question as if WSPS provides noise assessments as part of this campaign?
I can answer that question. My understanding, noise is not part of this campaign. Right. So Christina, just what Christina mentioned today, that those are the focuses of these campaigns. I imagine though the noise regulation is always there, so that's always important to be aware of and still be compliant with. And if the question was, does WS provide that service? It's two different services. So hygienists can come in and do a noise assessment to assess the noise to be compliant with the noise regulation. And we do have probably the same hygienist that can do the air assessments as well to be in compliant with Regulation 833 or the Designated Substance Assessment Regulation as well.
Perfect, thank you. And next question. Can the training link be shared?
We follow up with this after the presentation. We will send a link to various links for the FAQ document and a link to our webpage with all the training that we provide from WSPS. And I definitely encourage, if you're having any struggles finding information, always reach out to your local account manager from WSPS. They're really there to help you with your entire health and safety awareness and prevention. So they can help you navigate really anything for your health and safety program. And that is totally free of charge. Our, funded, that's part of our funding that we receive through the ministry to help our customers keep their workers safe. So please never hesitate to reach out to your local account manager to help you navigate that.
Excellent. And next question. Is there any recommended company for air exposure monitoring?
I can take that or did you want to speak to that, Christina?
For us, because we're in enforcement, we don't typically recommend anybody to do the air sampling. WSPS is one though that we do just because they are affiliated with the ministry, but you are open to really use any private consulting company that provides these services. The Occupational Hygiene Association of Ontario, for example, does have a list of consultants that could do air sampling for you. So that is one source where you could look to see if you're looking for consultants.
Great. Thank you. Yes, you don't have to use us, but of course, it's always great to be able to have the opportunity to connect with you and offer our services, but it's not required.
Thank you both. Next question. With the annual WHMIS/Joint Health and Safety Committee review, what do you suggest employers review with the committee?
Okay, so for this one, because of the changes in the information elements and the SDS and labels, I would suggest that would be a focus of the review for your WHMIS program. And as far as I don't know if this is part of the question, but as far as reviewing other health and safety programs, that's really up to you. It depends on how your workplace is organized. But for women specifically, I would say review the changes that are relevant to your products. So there are a lot of changes in the amended HPR that may not apply to your particular products, but the ones that do, those would be the ones that I would suggest you focus on.
Excellent. Thank you. And next question. Does this campaign just focus on WHMIS and OREG 833 or Hazardous Product Act and Hazardous Product Regulation also, which are very detailed?
Yes. So provincially, it's only on WHMIS 860 and Reg 833, But at the federal level, we are also doing a campaign to promote the changes in the HBR. So for those ones, we are targeting suppliers, so manufacturers, importers, distributors, hazardous products, and it could be any of those in the province. What we're doing there is we're just providing them some information elements and doing a questionnaire to get some information from them, and also really just describing what the different changes are in more detail than what I've done in this presentation. So that is also happening at the same time as the provincial enforcement. If you are a supplier in the audience and you need to know more about that campaign, please talk to me offline and I can provide you some more information.
Excellent. And that seems to be the end of the questions that are posted on the chat. Would anyone like to ask any additional questions?
Actually, there were some comments about the U.S. alignment with GHS. I just wanted to address that. So, the GHS, globally harmonized system, is really not that harmonized, unfortunately. The intent was to have everybody classify their products properly or the same way and have the same information elements in their SDS and labels. But in reality, each jurisdiction, each country kind of does their own thing. So there is misalignment between the U.S. and Canada and other jurisdictions. And with the changes in our HBR, the US, surprisingly, was kind of a little bit more delayed as far as implementing those changes. They had just recently announced what those changes are and what their transition period is going to be. And I literally just heard about it yesterday, so I don't know the details. But from what I can gather is, yes, there is still misalignment in terms of the changes and also misalignment in terms of the timing of the transition period. So for us, it ends December 2025. For them, depending on the product, if it's a substance or a mixture, depending on the type of supplier, there are different transition period ending for those. So I believe some of the dates will be sometime in 2026, and I've heard even something as late as 2027. So what the implication of that is, because in Canada we do import a lot from the US, our suppliers will have to work with their American counterparts to make sure that they're in compliance sooner than the end of their transition period. And also they need to make sure that they're in compliance with our Canadian regulations, not necessarily just their US regulations. So there is all of that Health Canada is looking at right now, hoping to align a little bit more, but it's always been like that, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. And we have one more question that was posted. What should an employer do if a supplier doesn't want to disclose information in the SDS? What should we do if every section of SDS says unknown or no data available?
Okay, great question. Let us know. Let them, your ministry hygienist know, let me know, and we can follow up with federal enforcement, because that's exactly what we do at federal enforcement. We make sure that the information is there, that the amount of information they provide is reasonable, and that if they're not in compliance with the hazardous products regulations, then we will, proceed with enforcement actions at that point.
Great. Thank you very much. And another question, can an employer accept an SDS which mentions trade secret for the composition of an ingredient?
Right, so I did see that comment earlier as well. So under Section 3 of the SDS, where the supplier is required to include the ingredients of their product, if they do not want to disclose the ingredient, they do have the option to apply under the Hazardous Materials Information Review Act to submit it as confidential business information. So they can have an exemption in terms of reporting it if they would go through the application process, and assuming Health Canada will approve that request. But if they only want to withhold the concentration or the concentration range of the ingredient, so they're okay to name the ingredient, they can use one of the prescribed concentration ranges in the HBR, like I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, as long as they would put somewhere in that section that the actual concentration or concentration range of the ingredient is being withheld as a trade secret. So there's a couple of ways of using the trade secret option, either completely not include the name, in which case you have to go through a much more involved process, or just withhold the concentration, and there are simpler options to do that.
Thank you. So if it's a trade secret, the ingredient probably isn't hazardous.
Not necessarily. And that's why they have to go through that application process. It's up to Health Canada to determine if the supplier is justified in withholding the identity of that particular ingredient. And they have different criteria on how they make those decisions. And I don't know a whole lot about that process, but it is up to Health Canada to allow a supplier to withhold an ingredient.
Does generic names for ingredients, are they accepted, like mineral oil / petroleum distillates?
Yes and no. Under Section 3 of the SDS, the supplier needs to disclose the name of the chemical, both the common name and scientific names, and any other synonyms or common names or other names that are used to refer to that ingredient. But they also have to provide the CAS number, so the chemical abstracts. Sorry, CAS. So yeah, the CAS number. They need to provide that in the SDS as well. So it's not enough to just put the generic name on there. They need to provide a lot more information. And again, if that information is missing, let us know and we'll address it with the supplier.
Next question is, what if in the hazard section, it says product isn't hazardous, but yet in other section, precautions are provided to wear PPE? What should the safety professionals do?
Right. So we do run into this a lot. And when we do our federal enforcement, when we're reviewing the SDS information, we do kind of keep an eye on the ones that claim that they're non-hazardous, while they're also still providing some toxicological information and they're still providing some precautions for PPE and exposure. In some cases, it could just be due diligence on the supplier part, where they would just kind of put in as much information, precautions they can, even though it's technically not classified as hazardous products. But more in a lot of situations, they actually are hazardous products. It's just for various reasons, the supplier classified as non-hazardous. And in those situations, we would deal with the supplier, get Health Canada to review the product classification, and then come to a decision on whether the product is in fact non-hazardous or not. So again, if you've got an issue with information in the SDS, let us know and we will deal with it at the federal level.
And the next question is an SDS required for ingredients such as cellulose powder or spices?
It depends. If the ingredients or the product falls under one of the hazard classifications in the HPR, then yes, an SDS will be required. Another example would be a consumer product. So a consumer product could be hazardous because it has toxicological properties and all that kind of stuff. But if it's classified as consumer product, then it will not technically does not require an SDS. So there's that distinction between consumer and hazardous products as well. And there are definitions for consumer and hazardous products. Generally speaking, a consumer product is something that anybody can buy, even if it's the exact same product as a hazardous product you would buy from a supplier. But that is a distinction between consumer products and hazardous products, and consumer products do not need an SDS.
And just to add to that note, if you have consumer products in your workplace, which are still hazardous, that doesn't relieve you of the duty to make sure people know how to handle them safely and have proper safe procedures. So just wanted to add that little part, that they still are hazardous, they're in your workplace. So as an employer, you have to take every precaution reasonable and protect them when using it.
Excellent point. Are SDSs required for medical products? So for example, in pharmaceuticals, the products that are for end users and for them to consume?
Most likely not. They could either be a consumer product or they could fall under the Food and Drugs Act, which is a different regulation altogether, and they would not require an SDS. Where an SDS could be required is in the manufacturing of these products, where there could be hazardous products involved in their manufacturing process, and the Hazardous Products Act and regulations will apply to that part of it, and they will need SDS for the ingredients, but not necessarily the final product.
Excellent. Anyone else have any additional? Oh, there's one more. Products like Windex, like the glass cleaner, you can buy them from Dollarama. Do we need SDS for that at our workplaces?
So because it comes from, because it's classified as a consumer product, because anybody can buy it, it technically does not need an SDS. Although you might find that a lot of vendors, I guess, retail suppliers will also provide an SDS, even though it's not required. So from you as an end user, if you buy it as a consumer product, no, you do not need an SDS for it. But as Tony mentioned, if it is a hazardous product, you still will need to train your workers on the hazards associated with that product.
Is there a place where they can find a list of consumer products?
I'm not sure. I suspect not, because there's a lot out there. But like I said, just as a general rule, if anybody can buy it, any member of the public can buy it, it's considered a consumer product. That would be the easiest way to differentiate between a consumer product and a hazardous product. If you have more questions on consumer products, there is a Consumer Products Act, I believe, that you can consult as well to get more information.
Excellent. Well, that's it for today. Oh, no, we have one more question. Some lubricants like WD-40 comes with SDS from the distributors like Canadian Tire, but how do we differentiate consumer products and WHMIS controlled?
Yeah, well, yeah, like I said, the easiest way is to just figure out where you bought it from, and if it is from Canadian Tire, then that would be a consumer product, even though they will have an SDS, even though they'll have the same hazard classifications and all that kind of stuff. It's really where it comes from that determines if it's a consumer product or not.
And I guess it doesn't hurt to have it. Like if you, as a best practice, if they're offering it, they have it. It's probably great to have it, so you have that information too, so you can include it. Don't feel you can't. But it's a great best practice to have it, but not expected.
For sure. So that's it for today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Christina and Tony for sharing their expertise. And we hope you found this information valuable and are more prepared on how to make your workplace safer for your workers.